Welcome to our sanctuary, where you will discover delightful horror stories, narrated to you with soothing rain sounds. Gather around and take it all in while sitting back and relaxing. Chapter 1. The Asylum Beckons. The dense fog clung to the skeletal remains of Whispering Pines Asylum, its tendrils wrapping around the crumbling walls like ghostly fingers. The iron gate stood ajar, rusted hinges groaning in protest against the wind. Dr. Evelyn Harper took a steadying breath, adjusting the strap of her equipment bag. Beside her, Michael shifted uncomfortably, his camera at the ready, while Sarah stared up at the building with a distant, almost haunted expression. "This place has a reputation for a reason," Sarah murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "People don't come back from here." Evelyn exchanged a glance with Michael before stepping forward. "That's why we're here, to find the truth." The wide entrance hall yawned before them, the shattered remains of chandeliers casting jagged shadows along the peeling wallpaper. Every step they took sent echoes cascading down the empty corridors, swallowed by the oppressive silence. The scent of mildew and decay lingered, thick and suffocating. Faded portraits of solemn-faced doctors and orderlies lined the walls, their eyes seeming to follow the intruders. As they ventured further inside, the weight of the building's history pressed upon them. This was more than just an abandoned asylum. It was a tomb, a place where suffering had soaked into the walls and refused to fade. A sudden noise made Michael freeze, a faint scuffing sound, like something moving just out of sight. The team exchanged uneasy glances. They weren't alone. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Dark. A faint whisper skittered through the air. Michael whipped around, his camera trained on the darkness. "Did you hear that?" Evelyn nodded, her pulse quickening. "Something's here." The temperature dropped abruptly. Sarah shivered, rubbing her arms as she peered down the endless hallway. They stepped over rusted gurneys and toppled wheelchairs, their wheels creaking eerily as if still in motion. Medical records lay scattered across the floor, faded photographs of patients staring up at them with hollow eyes. Some had names scrawled in red ink, notes detailing their conditions. Violent outbursts, hallucinations, incoherent screaming. Then the first door slammed. Sarah gasped, stumbling back as the heavy metal door at the end of the hall swung shut with a resounding bang. Michael cursed, panning his camera toward the disturbance. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices murmuring from unseen lips. The words were unintelligible at first, but then one stood out clear as day. "Leave." Sarah grabbed Evelyn's arm. "We should go. Now." But Evelyn was already moving toward the locked door, drawn to it by a force she couldn't explain. A nameplate hung crookedly on its surface. The Warden. The air around it felt charged, like the calm before a storm. Chapter 3. The Warden's Warning. The temperature plummeted further. Breath misted in the frigid air as the whispers crescendoed into wails. The door creaked open on its own, revealing an office frozen in time. Papers covered in frenzied scribbles littered the desk, and in the corner, a tall shadow loomed. Michael's camera trembled in his hands as the entity stepped forward. A man, or what had once been a man, clad in the tattered remains of a warden's uniform. His eyes were hollow pits of darkness, his mouth twisted in a grotesque sneer. "Intruders!" the voice rasped, layered with countless others. "You shouldn't have come." The lights flickered, and the walls trembled as an unseen force lashed out, sending the team stumbling. The room blurred, reality bending around them. Sarah screamed as icy fingers clamped around her wrist, dragging her toward the darkness. Evelyn lunged, grabbing Sarah's arm, yanking her free just as the entity surged forward. Michael was already bolting for the door. "Run!" Chapter 4. The Escape. They didn't need to be told twice. Sprinting through the labyrinthine corridors, pursued by spectral howls and slamming doors, they raced for the exit. The asylum seemed to fight against their escape, the walls shifting, stretching, closing in. The hallways were longer now, the turns unfamiliar, as if the building itself had changed its structure to trap them. Shadows reached from the corners, twisting into grasping hands. Sarah tripped, letting out a strangled cry as something clutched at her ankle. Michael yanked her up, dragging her forward as Evelyn slammed into the front doors with all her strength. With a final desperate push, they burst through, tumbling onto the cracked pavement. The wind howled, and behind them, the asylum shuddered before sinking back into its eerie silence. Breathless and shaking, Evelyn looked back. The warden stood in the doorway, his form already fading into the shadows. But as they turned away, his whisper echoed through the night. "You'll be back. They always come back." Chapter 5. Shadows of the Past. The asylum did not let them go so easily. That night, as they sat around the flickering glow of their lanterns at a nearby motel, Evelyn was the first to notice it. The whispering had followed them. At first, it was a faint rustling in the corners, barely more than a trick of the wind. Then, as the clock neared midnight, it grew louder. Sarah was staring at the mirror, her eyes wide with horror. "He's here," she whispered. A shadow loomed in the reflection, its shape unmistakable. The warden. Before they could react, the lights exploded into darkness, plunging them into chaos. Their equipment crackled with interference. Evelyn scrambled for her recorder, capturing the eerie, disembodied voice that called out their names. "You left too soon." Chapter 6. Return to Whispering Pines. With no other choice, the team was forced back into the asylum. It had drawn them in, whispering their names in the dead of night, appearing in the corners of their vision, distorting their reality. Sarah's connection to the asylum grew clearer. Her ancestor had once been a patient, subjected to the warden's cruel experiments. The moment they stepped past the gates, the wind stopped. The silence was suffocating. The doors swung open before them, as if inviting them inside. This time, the spirits were not content to simply haunt. They wanted blood. Chapter 7. The Lost Ones. In the darkness, Evelyn heard it first. The sound of children crying. Following the sound, they stumbled upon a hidden wing, its walls lined with rusted cribs and broken toys. The spirits of forgotten patients, the ones experimented on and discarded, reached out from the shadows. Sarah gasped as the cold fingers of a child's hand brushed her arm. "They were locked in here," she whispered. "They never had a chance." But the warden was watching. The air grew heavy, and the walls began to bleed. They had ventured too far. Chapter 8. The warden's grip. The asylum twisted around them, the layout shifting. The halls became endless, looping back upon themselves. The warden was toying with them, trapping them in his domain. Michael was the first to break. "We're never leaving," he muttered, his voice shaking. "He won't let us leave." Evelyn refused to accept it. They had uncovered too much. The names of the missing, the truth of the asylum's horrors. But knowledge came at a price. Chapter 9. Sacrifices. Sarah had been marked. The warden wanted her, and the spirits clawed at her as they moved, trying to drag her deeper into the asylum. Desperate, Evelyn turned to an old ritual she had read about, a way to break the hold of a vengeful spirit. The ritual required a sacrifice. Michael stepped forward. "If one of us has to stay behind, it won't be her." The spirits howled in response. The walls cracked. The asylum trembled as the ritual began. Chapter 10. The Final Hour. The air filled with deafening screams as the warden fought against them. The ritual burned through the darkness, tearing open a way out. But as they ran for the exit, Michael faltered. The warden's grip tightened around him. "No!" Evelyn screamed, reaching for him. He looked at her, a sad smile on his lips, before the shadows consumed him. The doors slammed shut, and then, silence. Sarah sobbed, clutching Evelyn as they stood outside the asylum. The sky beginning to lighten, Whispering Pines stood as it always had, silent, waiting. "He's still in there," Sarah whispered. "And so is Michael." The warden had won a piece of them, but for now, they were free. For now.